This week, we continue the podcast. I have another one for you this week with Nick Iafrate of the Institute for Psychosystems Analysis. This time around, we're continuing the discussion into the subject of the complex. What is a complex and how do they operate within the psyche? And then we go from there into the deeper waters of the metaphysics of analytical psychology. And hopefully you'll find this some fascinating stuff. So sit back, crack open a cold one, and enjoy. And let us know what you think.
Second time around with Dr. Eric Goodwin. Thank you for being here, sir. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed our last conversation. I feel like coming from that last conversation, it just, I could talk to you for hours about this stuff and just the conversation would evolve and evolve.
Yeah.
But today I think we'll just kind of dive in and start with, we can start with complexes and then we can kind of dig into mind body, maybe psychophysiological, how complexes arise from a conscious perspective, whereas how we experience them and that affect, how that digs into mind body and how that kind of translates over, and then get into a little bit more of the metaphysical stuff.
All right, I think it's a good roadmap. So my understanding of complex is it comes originally from Jung's experiments on the word association tests. And he found that certain words would take longer for people to come up with an association for others. So it's not so much what the word is that they associate it to. What he was measuring was how long it takes for you to give an answer. And that, when he did those experiments, he found that certain concepts, anything that was kind of related to that in terms of meaning, would get the same effect. So that caused him to develop this idea that we have complexes, which are basically clusters of interrelated ideas centered around a common theme, and things like fathers or children, or they tend to be emotionally charged, and he called them complexes because a lot of times they contain conflicting maybe feelings or ideas. Those would emerge during development due to various things happening to people. You might say, I think the most well-known complex actually doesn't come from Jung. It comes from Adler, who coined the phrase the inferiority complex. And I don't know who came up with the idea first, but Jung had a whole lot of other complexes that he looked at, like a mother complex and all that sort of thing. The animus and the anima are technically complexes, and they are clusters of ideas centered around the concept of interpersonal connection and intimacy. So that would be the anima or the animus complex. So that's, in therapy, you can find those sorts of things when you're talking about something and you get an emotional response. Like the patient will kind of shut down maybe when a certain subject is brought up. That's a dead giveaway. And that's kind of what the word association test was getting at, but in a less, intense sort of way. In therapy, the responses are more intense, typically, and you can get those kind of reactions. Most of them are, like I said, emotionally derived. Many of them are unconsciously driven, and so they kind of feel surprising to the ego. Like, man, what is that all about? Then you're onto something, onto a complex. But I think to get at what you were alluding to earlier, Jung, I think after studying the complex for a while, he realized that there seemed to be a core idea which organized complexes themselves. And that's what he first kind of started talking about, the archetypes, as an innate driving force of the psyche that attracts certain kinds of clusters of ideas around them and forms images, either in dreams or fantasy or whatever, And those are images, are symbols and metaphors of the emotional process that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So the father complex, it doesn't just happen from our experience of fathers, because what would start that to begin? Like, why would you ever differentiate people into fathers and not fathers? Well, he thought that was more the innate part of it, that we come into the world with an expectation of a fatherly kind of character somewhere in our environment, and the psyche is primed to look for it and suck up ideas connected to it to create these images. And so that primary force that doesn't have any content in it, but it has form, is the archetype.
So would it also be, it's almost like, if we look at it from Panksepp's perspective, right, or from instinctual systems, so that kind of relating is a prerequisite to the actual experience, right? So that's seeking outward. And I mean, this is how kind of us, at the IPSA, we kind of conceptualize it. It is that the instinct drives forward, right? The complex is built around it, and that's the actual, the experience, the memory, the affect is almost built around kind of that core instinctual foundation of the complex.
Yeah, that makes sense, describing it that way. The instinct, Jung often would call it a form without content, but he often describe the archetype. And I think that's a pretty good way to look at it, because a form, I mean, there's a lot wrapped up in that terminology. Like, what is a form? Well, a form is an arrangement. An arrangement of what? Well, it depends on what we're talking about here. If you want to get into classical depictions of form, and of course Jung was well versed in the classics, you might say you could look at Aristotle, who would talk about the two statues of Zeus, say one made of marble and the other made of bronze. Well, they both have the same form, but the material is very different. Bronze and marble are completely different, but you still recognize it. Why? Because it has the same form. But the form itself is not something that is physical. It's an arrangement. It's a shape, and that doesn't have its own mass, and all that. It's more of a configuration. And so I think that, getting back to the idea of the archetypes, there's a form that the psyche has a tendency to create, but the raw material is experience itself as we grow up, experience and memory and all that kind of stuff. But those things have to follow in, they have to fall into the grooves of the patterns of the forms, and then you end up with the archetypal image at the end of the process. So connecting that to Panksepp, Panksepp describes these very instinctual, almost reflexive type of responses. They're not fully reflexive because they have sophistication to them. It's not just like tapping a tendon and the knee jerks.
Right.
That's very one-dimensional, and it's kind of an all or nothing. But between that and like complex abstract thought, there's a whole spectrum of stuff between basic reflexes like that, and some of the in-between stuff are tendencies to organize information in a particular way, and like around fear, around seeking, around rage. That's where Panksepp's work is interesting and useful, and connects to Jung, I think, because he's talking about innate mechanisms in the mind or the brain or what have you that say, okay, here's an environment that I'm in, and say I'm being attacked. Well, that triggers the fight or flight response. But those two responses are not they're instinctive. They're not reflexive, because they're more sophisticated than that, right? They have a whole host of different things that can go along with flight, running away or freezing or right, avoiding, that kind of stuff. And there's the internal and the external manifestation of that too. So the external manifestation might be to run away. The internal manifestation of a scary thought might be to avoid it. But it's the same process, the same form. It's flee, go away. We don't have to learn that we need to do that. We already know that that's what we need to do. So an example of this, to kind of bring this out of the abstract, would be, and I'll have to thank my grandchildren because I use them all the time in these examples, having watched them grow up a little bit. They're still little, but my granddaughter and I were playing, and there was this little cat toy, and it started bouncing around on its own, and she absolutely flipped out, and she squealed and ran away. And I thought to myself, I mean, once I calmed her down and told her everything was okay, but I got to ask, thinking about that, like, where did she learn to do that? Right? Of course she didn't. That's an instinctive response, but it's a complex response. There's a lot of organization that has to go on to elicit that. I have to squeal, and I have to run away, and I have to make a big show of things so that the big people can come over here and help me. Right. Save me from the squiggly thing, whatever the hell it is, Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's kind of what we were talking about last time, the ancestral memory part of it. But, that's where the forms, where they come from.
Right.
From the on the biological side.
Mm-hmm. There's just so much there. There's just so much there.
Yeah, too much, probably.
Right? Yeah, but it is. It's and I think about innate release mechanisms, right? And
right.
Going out in the environment, and you talked about this your paper on archetypes and the impoverished gene theory, and in your conclusion, you pretty much mention it, just like it's the experience in the external environment that will kind of release these things. Mm-hmm. The instinct is kind of the prerequisite, but your exposure to it in the external environment will kind of develop, and maybe not even develop, but there will be a follow through in terms of action, right?
Yeah.
And depending on the level of fulfillment thereof, right, you might have a complex around it in terms of the next time you experience it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So then that really is, and that's either that's adaptive and continues to be adaptive, or in a positive way, or it's maladaptive in terms of it had an initial use, but now it's becoming more and more maladaptive as you live throughout your lifespan development.
Right. And that's one of the challenges for these discussions here is when people talk about instincts, they often conflate that with the idea of reflexes. Mm. And I don't think that anyone means reflex when they use the word instinct. Mm. Nevertheless, the terminology gets mangled.
Right.
And, what you're talking about are instinctive release mechanisms that are spoken of constantly in biology. It's very well known, process, but in, some circles of psychology, I guess, those sorts of things are just not on the radar. And so they don't think of that as a logical way to think about human beings. And because humans do so much learning, right. In fact, our whole developmental scheme is designed around massive amounts of learning. That's why it takes us forever to become adults. There's really no reason why we would need to take so long to be full grown. Look at other animals. They get to full grown way quicker. But we have these massive brains, and it makes more sense to take our time, because that's kind of where we put all our eggs in that one basket, But nevertheless, that doesn't mean there aren't any instinctive processes. In fact, some thinkers thought, even as far back as William James, that we have probably more instincts than animals do. Mm. But there's been a whole lot of people saying, no, we don't have any instincts, and I think it's nonsense. But how they work, though, is I talk a lot about constraints and biases in my writing, and I think that's mainly how it works. The forms come about because our sensory system and our learning and our conceptual systems have all of these constraints and biases built into them, and that's what's really innate, fully innate. Doesn't require any learning at all. And yet it will shape the way that the information comes in and how it's put together based on constraints, but it's not rigid. There's a lot of flexibility. So like when my granddaughter saw the squiggly thing moving, there's only a certain number of things that would naturally ensue from that. Like one is squealing and running away, and the other one might, I guess, be ignore it. But there's not a whole lot of let's go eat it, not at age 3, that maybe at 6 months, but at 6 months, you've got a whole different set of challenges, awaiting you, So anyway, the constraints and the biases shape how it develops, and then it keeps going. And those, they stay there. The pressures on the development continue. So I'm having to be real abstract here.
No, but it makes sense because
Hopefully it makes sense.
in terms of constraints and biases, at 3, like you said, it might not be, hey, let's go out and let's eat that, right? Because at 3, the constraints and biases and the kind of predisposition might be, okay, somebody's going to feed me. I don't have to necessarily instinctually worry about that because it will be provided. But for me at 30, it might be, I'm starving. I need to go eat that thing.
Right. Yeah.
So
or you might have the experience of caretakers saying that's not anything to worry about. So I think what a lot of psychology has done is looked at that as the sole causal factor, is what you learn from caretakers, and don't pay much attention to the fact that the initial response was to run away from it without any basis on why. And that's where the evolutionary psychology comes in and says, well, running away from squiggly things is probably adaptive. And so that leads then to it being more easy to develop snake phobias than, say, warm coffee phobias, right?
Right.
That are relatively neutral to our development versus poisonous animals that could potentially kill you. And we've been exposed to that for thousands and thousands of years as probably humans and before. And in fact, I believe most, if not all, primates have an innate predisposition to fear snakes, except for lemurs, because I don't think there's any snakes on Madagascar. I could be wrong about that, but I seem to remember something about that in the reading. So we're primates, so that's how far back that goes.
Right.
I remember one time in a discussion with Gene Knox about this, and I was talking about how we have a very strong tendency to form phobias of snakes and spiders, but not things like electric, outlets and cars, because of our exposure to them over deep time. And she said, well, I've a quick Google search and you'll be able to find people that have car phobias, which completely misses the point that I was trying to make.
Right.
Yeah, those people might exist, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm asking, why on earth would we have so many more snake phobias than car phobias? That's the real question. And that would have to be instinct,
right?
And archetype.
And then it gets into, like we were talking about in terms of complexes, the context in which an individual experienced something more numinous, like a phobia set, let's say, for snakes, right? That might be kind of cross-culturally more of a kind of innate instinct towards, okay, I need to, that not good. But in terms of a car phobia, right, it being less the case, it might have more so to do with the individual's experience, how that relates to a specific instinct, and then the continuation of a complex around, right? So if like I have a car phobia, I go outside, there are cars everywhere, right? So I'm kind of in a position where that complex is going to be ever present, and it really, this gets into the mind body. What are the psychophysiological symptoms of said complex? And I would argue that, all right, somebody who has a deeply embedded instinct and kind of adverse reaction towards exposure to snakes, right? Which might be, it goes all the way back to our ancestry with primates, right? That response would be highly intensive. Now, the response for somebody with a car phobia might be equally as intensive, maybe if not more so, right? That is what really interests me about kind of the mind-body issue that we were talking about earlier, which is, okay, I might experience these symptoms physically before I actually consciously notice said stimulus.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So what? Yeah. So when you mentioned the mind-body, there's a lot of different discussions that use those two words, and it sounds to me like what you're talking about is, how does the mind experience the body? Is something like along those lines, or how does the body express itself via unconscious, or at least pre-conscious affects, concepts, whatever. And that's certainly a very interesting question, and it leads philosophically to the mind-body problem, which is a specific use of those terms, and that's an old problem, thousands of years old. It goes into the question of what is it about, I guess the best modern way to put it would be, what is it about buzzing neurons that make you experience things the way that you do? So the classic, one of the commonly used examples here would be the pain response. And we know pain is caused by, quote unquote, pain fibers in the body firing. Okay. Now, the philosopher would come to say, okay, but what is it about pain fibers blipping that makes them feel the way they do? Why does it feel like pain and not something else? What's so special about them? You know, that's the mind-body problem. And Jung, he knew some of this. I mean, he knew that there was a whole lot of things going on in the world of neurology in his day, but he was always skeptical of reductive attempts to break down the psyche and say that it's just this, it's just neurons, it's stuff like that, you know. And Freud wanted to do that, but then decided it was hopeless at the time because he didn't feel like neuroscience was advanced enough. It wasn't in his day. It is now, but we still don't have the answer to the question. And in fact, many philosophers out there think that it is not possible to explain consciousness with neuroscience. Now, there's of course others out there who think that's heresy to say that, you know, and I was one of them at one time in my life. I'm not anymore because, you know, I've read enough about the problem to recognize that it does not seem to be an empirical problem or a problem of lack of knowledge. It seems to me a conceptual problem. Like the word psyche and the physical objects that we call neurons may not be comparable in that particular way when we ask ourselves, how is it that the brain creates the mind? See? But so the metaphysical question that you're getting to here is that's the mind-body problem. How does the brain create the mind? That's one framing of it. I think it's an incorrect way of framing it, actually, because it assumes a physicalist framework. So there's a lot of different answers to this question, and the most common one that you'll hear about today amongst philosophers is physicalism, which says that the brain creates the mind, right? So it's not even, it's saying not how does it do it, it's saying that it must be the case that the brain creates the mind. The mind is derivative from the brain. In other words, the world of subjective experience is derivative from matter. See, so that's what they mean. That's what those guys mean when they're talking about mind and body. Body being the physical, mind being the whatever it is, right? And the funny thing about mind is we may not know what it is, but we do know it exists better than we know anything else exists, in fact, because I'm sitting here experiencing it, you know, all the time. I mean, I know that's there, and that's kind of what Descartes came to, but his solution to it was to say that mind and matter were completely separate substances entirely. That's dualism. That's not a very popular position these days, and it's got a lot of problems with it. And yet it has an intuitive appeal because the concepts of mental and the physical seem to be very distinct. And yet, does that distinction actually reflect a true metaphysical difference of substance, or is it just a conceptual difference?
Right.
Right. So the conceptual difference is fine, dandy. Nobody worries about that too much. To say it's a truly metaphysical difference is a whole nother animal. And so the Descartes might say that, no, it reflects a truly metaphysical difference, which means that you can have minds floating around there that aren't connected to any sort of matter at all. Now, obviously, that's not a new idea. It's been around for a while, spirits and all that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, physicalists would reject that. They're monists in terms of substance, right? Rather than dualists. They say there is only one substance, and that's matter, and mind is derivative from that. Idealists flip it around. They say the first substance is mind only, matter is derivative of mind. There's not a whole lot of those guys around anymore either. And the only real issue, I don't really tackle that so much in my writing. It does have one kind of classic problem with it, which is, if that's the case, then why is it that matter behaves in such a regular fashion? Because it could be anything and behave in any way it wanted to if it was all derivative from the mind. And of course, the other question is, the mind of what? Me? So I'm like the ultimate source of the universe? Well, that seems a little bit out of there.
Right.
So of course, then they defer to God and they say it's the mind of God, and everything else is the way it is because of God's will. Well, as you can imagine, there's not a whole lot of philosophers that find that very satisfying answer to the question. Right. You know, it's like, okay, I guess we're done. I think Jung, bringing this back to Jung, would have gone with something different from all of these. And there is yet another position out there called neutral monism, or it's sometimes called dual aspect monism, which says that there is a fundamental substance, but it's not matter or mind. It's something else from which matter and mind are both themselves derived. This was a view that it's been around forever, but Spinoza is the one who's listed as like the most articulate defender of this idea, multiple aspect monism. And when you look at Jung's writings on this, he often says things like, I think that mind and matter are fundamentally the same thing, that they look like they're the same thing, but from different perspectives. So that would align him definitely with the neutral monists or the dual aspect monists. And there's a number of philosophers out there that rigorously defend this idea, like David Chalmers, for example, is very famous for this. And I don't know if you have any familiarity with these names of these people, but
well, I think Mark Solms as well talks about dual
Solms,
aspect.
definitely. Yeah. Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah. And now, in fact, his work was the first encounter I had with the idea. And in fact, he addresses it in his Mind in the Inner World, or the Brain in the Inner World. Fantastic book. I've had the opportunity of discussing some of this stuff with him, and it's a really interesting guy. But anyway, yeah, so that's the perspective that he takes. I think Jung would, and a lot of that comes from his interaction with Wolfgang Pauli, actually, the famous physicist, who knew matter. Pauli knew matter really well. He's a physicist, you know, and of course Jung knew the mind really well because he was young. So.
Now, do you think Jung would have agreed with it at certain points during his time here, right, in terms of his career? Because I feel like there are points in Jung's life where he does have a tendency to reduce things to psyche, right? And then I tend to, when I read Jung and I think about that, I also tend to think about brain damage, right? And where is the Jungian self, right, with someone that has brain damage?
That jumps right at the heart of the mind-body problem itself. Because what you're asking is, how does the subjective experience relate to what the brain is doing, right? Same question with our pain fiber example before. Right. It's just a more complex version of it. It's, why is it that when pain fibers are not firing, we don't feel pain? And when they do, all of a sudden we go, ouch, what's up with that? You know what? You can look at pain fibers all day long and not figure that out. But to get back to your question, it's a great question. I think he early on was more biological in his thinking, and more trying to explain archetypes in terms of instincts and evolution and all that stuff. And that later on in his career, he started to dive more into this metaphysical stuff, and he kind of forgot about the biological stuff along the way. Because I think he had just been much more distant from it, and he was working at the higher level for so long. You know, and remember, he started off working with severely mentally ill schizophrenics in the Bergholz Clinic, where he saw some really messed up, you know, mental states. And of course, we do know that schizophrenia has a very sound biological basis. We don't have it all worked out yet, but we know that the brain is not organized the same way in schizophrenia that it is otherwise. So but the mind body or the philosophical question to ask then is, well, then why does it present the way it does? You know, and there's some interesting answers to that. Now, here's where the interface is between psychiatry and philosophy. Let's say I have the most amazing brain scans of a schizophrenic and a non-schizophrenic, and I can look at the schizophrenic and say, okay, when his brain is doing this thing, like the connectivity is messed up or whatever, there's new evidence that that's probably what's going on, is the connectivity is not what it should be in different regions. When he does this, then he presents with schizophrenic symptoms. And then the other guy, the normal person, not so much. Okay, but that doesn't answer the mind-body problem. That's correlation. That's what Chalmers calls the easy problem of neuroscience. It's just correlating the experiences with the brain stuff. The hard problem is figuring out why.
Right.
The brain, when it does this, it presents that way. That's the hard problem. And he says that there is no as yet solution to it, and it doesn't look like there's anyone on the horizon. Now, the usual answer to that is, well, maybe we'll figure it out someday. That's what he calls promissory materialism. You know, someday we'll figure it out. But I don't think we can, because now the way Chalmers defends this is he uses this philosophical zombie argument, which is that we might have a brain that looks, for all intents and purposes, exactly like a normal functioning brain, and yet that person doesn't have any subjective experience, and we could never tell. That should not be the case if there's some easy explanation that we can jump from brain to mind. See, now I'm condensing an entire book with that. So if you can find holes in it, it's just because I've not been able to get through all the details. But it's a pretty sound argument. It's a lot of philosophers have responded to this and tried to get around it, but I haven't really seen them succeed very well. It's a strong argument. It's actually one that's been around for quite a while, but he articulates in a way that's really tough to, weasel out of. It's like, well, yeah, okay. And he was led from that conclusion, kicking and screaming, to something called panpsychism. So panpsychism, for anyone out there who doesn't know, is the idea that psyche exists within the entire universe, that it's everywhere. It's a fundamental feature of matter, just like mass and velocity. And so that's really the only way that you can possibly solve the mind-body problem and the hard problem of neuroscience, is to assume that there must be some psyche within everything, including even electrons, very humble objects like that. Now, there is a problem with that. Panpsychism. It depends. There's two different versions of it, broadly speaking. There's micropsychism, which says that psyche is in everything, even down to little electrons, and they have little tiny protopsyches. I don't know what they're thinking about, but who knows? They probably have a very negative outlook on life.
Right.
Then there's cosmopsychism, which says that the universe itself is a conscious entity of some sort. So the micropsychist has a problem. It's called the combination problem. And that is, how do I reconcile the fact if I've got all these little particles that all have their little tiny micropsyches, and all of a sudden I jam them together and get a macropsyche out of that? Well, how does that work? Okay. And that problem has been recognized since the days of William James, at least. Now, cosmopsychism doesn't have that problem, because it says that all of the psyches that we see around us, including our own, are derivative from the cosmic consciousness. And again, the idea that the universe is conscious, again, an ancient idea, goes back to thousands of years ago. The universe is God, and that sort of thing. Pantheism.
Yeah.
Now, in a recent paper that I just published on this, I go through why I think that the cosmopsychist side of panpsychism actually does resolve most of the issues of the hard problems and the mind-body problem. But I do admit that it does mean that you have to accept a pretty hefty premise, and I try to address that too. I mean, it is it seems implausible to suggest the entire universe is conscious somehow. Like, what in the world is it thinking about? But then I use the analogy of, okay, but we do know that we have consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But we as human beings in our bodies are composed of parts. So consciousness it's a whole part thing. That's what all of this, I think, boils down to. Is mereology. Is the whole greater than the sum of its parts or not? And that holism is something that's prevalent throughout Jung's work, which is kind of what led me to this solution to begin with. You don't need Jung to make this argument, but it's how I ended up there. And that is that the psyche, we experience the world as if it were coherent and unified. Right? Well, there must be some way that that's possible. And if you look at it as being created by neurons buzzing around in a particular that's all bits and pieces and parts. You can't get the whole from that. So how does that work? I said, well, the only solution is that it must flow the other way, which means that the whole is greater and prior. So that means that's what leads you to cosmopsychism, that our consciousness is derivative from the macro, like the cosmic consciousness. Okay, well, yeah, but what is that like? Well, I think if I know I have consciousness, at least I'm pretty darn sure. Otherwise, how could I even be talking about this? And yet I am composed of parts myself, including all these neurons. Does the individual neuron have any inkling of what I'm thinking as the whole? Probably not. It'd be kind of hard for it to imagine that, in fact. And yet that's the situation we're in with respect to the universe. Right? So we're a part of the universe too.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's no logical way that we might be able to tap into the cosmic consciousness, barring things like parapsychological phenomena, mm-hmm. which is gaining more and more evidence and acceptance, finally, after 120 years of this, okay. So, barring those sorts of visionary experiences, Jung talks about a lot of those, like near-death experiences, all that kind of stuff, in which case you might be getting a glimpse of what that is. It's going to be pretty much beyond our typical ability to comprehend.
Right.
That's why it seems like such a crazy solution. But logically, it works. So there you go.
There we are.
There we are. Right? The universe is a conscious entity of some kind, and somehow we're derivative from that. Now, to get all of the nitty gritty of this, I'd have to, read my paper to you, which you don't want me to do because it's long.
Maybe we should. Maybe we should. I mean, it kind of, it's begs a question in getting back to, instincts and what those are and where those come from.
Right. And those are the parts.
Right.
Those are the parts. And they do seem to have a conscious mentality of their own. Mm-hmm. And there's more and more, there's people thinking about this in terms of biology, that cells may have some kind of type of awareness of their own, even trees and that kind of thing. And what it all boils down to, like, what is it about something that must be necessary for consciousness to be there? Mm. It appears to me that you have to have an object of some kind that is integrated. So this comes from another psychiatrist's theory, a guy named Guillermo Tononi, who advocates for this thing called integrated information theory. Long story short, if something is integrated, meaning each part of it is sensitive to every other part, that's the necessary condition. Why, nobody knows, but that seems to be the case. In every instance that we've seen of something behaving as if it had consciousness, it's in a system like that, where there's dense, very sensitive interactivity. And you can even see this in the body itself. If I look at the cerebellum, say, versus the frontal cortex, the cerebellum actually has more neurons by far than the frontal cortex does. In fact, the cerebellum, if you look at all the neurons in the entire body, the cerebellum contains half of them, ton in there. But they're not organized in a way that is as integrated as the frontal cortex is. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the cerebellum is set up in kind of a feed forward organization. The stuff comes
Right.
in, it goes through a ton of processing, and then you get an output. But there's not a whole lot of feedback. There's some, but there's
Right.
not a lot. The frontal cortex, though, everything feeds back on everything else.
Yep.
Now, if I remove the cerebellum, I don't affect consciousness. I mean, I affect it, but I don't get rid of it. I don't remove it from the entity. They're still conscious. Now they're clumsy. So, oh, crap. And when that happens, sometimes people can compensate, fascinatingly enough. It's unrelated, but the rest of the brain can sometimes kind of take over the job.
Right.
Incredible. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that if I remove or use drugs to dim the awareness of the frontal cortex, consciousness goes away. Now I'm unconscious, right? So what's up with that? And it seems to be that the key feature is integratedness. But integratedness is only a property of a whole, not parts. See? So that's where a lot of this kind of boils down to is the reason we're conscious is because the brain in its connection and interconnection with everything else in the body is a coherent whole that is tightly integrated. Now, why is that required for conscious awareness to emerge? I don't know.
I mean, I'm just theorizing here. I mean, it sounds like you have, and you talk about this in a lot of your writing, you have these certain parts of neurobiology that are very just forward, right? There isn't a lot of feedback going on. Frontal cortex being that kind of, I don't want to say the hub of consciousness, right? But there is some level of, because we can't actually say that, but the level of plasticity that is needed for the internal and external kind of inputs and outputs, right? And it just, now it begs the question in terms of, and I want to kind of bring this back into like individual experience in therapy, right? Because if it is the case, you have this level of reciprocity and communication between the internal and external. Consciousness is kind of feeding with that, right?
Yes.
But it's not as though we can just tell someone, hey, listen, this is what's happening. It might be that's the case. But, and this gets into your use of metaphoric language and talking about metaphor and how the unconscious communicates with that. And when I think of the mind-body problem, I definitely don't think about it as, I'm not a dualist by any means. But when I think about it in terms of treatment, I think about it as, okay, how do we communicate with that part of the person, right, that might not be conscious, that wants them to heal and be better? Yeah. And I immediately think of metaphoric language.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because that, so much of what goes on in the mind is pre-linguistic or non-linguistic. It's why? Well, because metaphors unite. They bring things together in images. They combine concepts. I mean, the word symbol means to bring together. Jung points this out. And, or throw together, I think is what the Greek is. And consciousness itself does the same kind of thing, which is why therapy works, because we're bringing stuff that's not in the fold. It's not integrated. It's still off on its own, doing its own thing. The complex is running the show. It can sometimes wreak havoc. I see this all the time in people who have, let's say, I have a person with trauma history and a lot of trust problems, but they don't have a real good insight into it. They don't have much of a grasp. They come in, they have all these complaints. They have back pain and neck pain, and they have chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and irritable bowel syndrome and all, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these things, of course, have a physiological basis of some kind. And we're still trying to sort that out. But there's a psychological basis too, and they're not mutually exclusive at all. And in fact, what I find in therapy working with people is that if they don't have good insight into the trust issue, say, and they don't know me that well, and I prescribe a medication for them, they're going to come back to me with a bunch of weird side effects that don't make any physiological sense. Like it's causing my left ear to burn terribly, doc, Now I have a couple of options here, right? I can look at them and say, you're nuts, and just dismiss them, right? Obviously they don't like that too much. And I understand why. That's a crappy move. of course, I don't do that. I teach my residents to listen to that as a communication. It is a communication, but it's not, it's on a different channel, right? It's not on the wavelength of conscious awareness. Now, ideally, you can work with somebody in therapy and get them to see that there's a symbolic meaning behind their symptoms, right? And that can lead to a lessening of the symptoms. It may not go away. You know, there may be something that's very deeply entrenched in there that is resistant to, absorption into the conscious fold, but
Right.
then that happens sometimes. But a lot of times you can get a lot of improvement from that. And this kind of speaks to Jung's concept of integration, or, the transcendent function. Individuation is what he calls it. And that's kind of where I tie it in with Tononi's research. Is the whole is the thing that is integrated, but we're not at maximal levels of integration unless we're like, Zen masters or something, right? And every day there's new crap coming in that's throwing curveballs and wrenches in the machine, so it's a constant effort to try to bring it into awareness, because awareness is where the integration can happen.
Mm-hmm.
But and conscious awareness is the maximal point of integratedness,
mm-hmm.
just in terms of the physiology, right? The way that the neurons are behaving. So I don't think it's a coincidence that that's also how psychologically it must work.
Right.
And so that maybe kind of ties into what you're talking about with the complexes, which have a mentality of their own that's kind of broken off. It's like we started today talking about how they develop, and much of the associations are made unconsciously in very early life. And if they don't get brought into awareness, they'll stay there,
right?
And just kind of, fester,
yeah,
or sit there and cause problems, And these things get pictured in dream material as separate entities, other characters, animals, all that kind of stuff. If it's something numinous, it might appear like a god or a goddess, or if it's something very powerful and instinctive, it might appear like an animal, that kind of thing. But that's the psyche trying to bring it back in and trying to make sense of it and say, hey, there's this thing here. Like, what's up with that? There's this part over here. What's going on? And it's, say in the dream, it's attacking you. All right. Well, that tells me what's happening is that this is complex. You haven't dealt with it. It's fighting you. And then I look to see what the ego is doing in the dream. I'm running from it. I'm attacking it. I don't know. If you say, though, this thing is attacking you, it's some kind of complex that's causing you a lot of grief in waking life, the dream creates the picture for you and says, this is what that thing looks like, quote unquote. Well, then I can, of course, use that in therapy and say, what happens if you sit down and you try to pet the dog that's attacking you, or the tiger, or the gorilla, or whatever it is? And what does that look like? What does that feel like? You can communicate to that stuff directly that way. And even though if the conscious awareness might be like, what is this doctor talking about? He's talking nonsense. But the emotion's listening, and they'll absorb it, and you'll see the change sometimes without awareness. So it's kind of a Jedi mind trick thing that we do sometimes. But it's better, I think, to be aware of what's going on and to be able to label it and bring it into clear, hold it up to the light.
Yeah. That this conversation just kind of went full circle.
Yeah.
I love it. Because I agree, and I think the kind of level of suggestion. Oh, first and foremost, I think the complexes are these parts that need to be integrated, and whether they need to continue for the positive adaptation, or they need to be kind of resolved and rolled out, almost like a muscular knot.
I like that metaphor.
Yeah, and then really it's up to us to, and where I find it most fascinating is digging in that suggestive language in terms of the symbolism, in order to kind of it's less of a direct order that the unconscious might not necessarily respond to positively.
It might respond very negatively to that.
Yeah, and it's more of a, all right, why don't we try? It's a suggestion around,
What if we did this?
Right.
I'm engaging the imagination, which is has an inherently integrative direction to it, I think. The imagination directs our memory, and we can do a whole thing on that. Maybe we'll do that next time. So, but I absolutely, I agree with that. And, Well, symbols and metaphors by their very nature are integrative entities.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's good to use them.
I feel like this is going to I'm going to rewatch this and want to just continue to unpack all of it,
Yes.
and just keep going.
Keep going.
But I know we're at 2:01, and I know we probably have to head out. But Dr. Goodwin, I really appreciate the second conversation. I feel like everybody that's going to watch this is going to just not only enjoy it, but it's going to kind of lead them down the rabbit hole a little bit further, and open up new questions, and maybe open up new suggestions.
Yeah,
Possibly.
absolutely. Yeah.
But we'll do this again soon, and I really appreciate the time you've given.
Great to be here. Okay, look forward to the next time.
All right, sir. I'll see you soon.